Many a birder is reasonably familiar with the story. In late August 2023, Hurricane Idalia crashed into the northern Gulf Coast of Florida and scattered flamingos far and wide. I wish I had some role to play with the flamingo part, but alas, I couldn't find any. So for me, this is the epitome of case studies for birding and weather-induced vagrancy. That's because there were no flamingos throughout most of the United States beforehand. It was clearly caused by a storm, caused by the hurricane. And most importantly, flamingos are unbelievably distinctive. So anytime one showed up anywhere within sight of a human being, word was going to get out where it was because it was so startling. So back in the day, I was thinking about different ways that birds could be affected by hurricanes in terms of like migration or vagrancy. And I came up with these 5 terms just sort of for myself, but it helps me frame what's going on. So grounded would just be overhead migrants coming down. Deviated is, you have a bird species with a route in mind that's been shifted from the route they would normally take. Displaced would be a bird that is sort of physically pushed against its will from one location to another. And trained would be sort of any of the above 3 that get caught up in the circulation right in the core of a hurricane and then are forced to go where the hurricane goes. And finally, vagrants in particular might become adrift after a hurricane where they get so lost that they just sort of start wandering far and wide, usually for long periods of time after the storm has passed. So to break down the weather, I would love to read this National Hurricane Center report in a dramatic voice. And do the old Idalia originated in the far eastern Pacific Ocean, but I'm not going to do that. I went through and highlighted some of the key elements, and to zip through it quick, it just formed a closed circulation, so a center of low pressure with all air flowing into that center 26th of August in the morning. Weak steering currents caused it to make an unusual southward motion after that center formed. So 18 hours later, it actually brushed the island of Cozumel just off the Yucatan Peninsula. At that time, it got stronger, formed enough of a core and had enough banding to become Tropical Storm Idalia, and got stronger, but it also didn't really go anywhere still. It stalled again around that time before finally turning east and then north and began a fastward motion. It then rapidly intensified as it pulled north of Florida in this really favorable environment for a hurricane to strengthen. It was really quite big. There were heavy bands of rain hitting Florida as it passed by well offshore. And made landfall as a major hurricane. And all of these storms lose strength as they move inland fairly quickly because they get their energy from the ocean water, and skirted through Georgia and went back out over the Atlantic off the Carolinas and dissipated. And so this is that classic hurricane map, and it illustrates this weird, slow southward motion as a fairly weak tropical depression, and then turned into a tropical storm as it headed east and then north, and then rapidly intensified into a hurricane and a major hurricane over a short period of time. So you can see from the 26th to the 29th, it made it this far, and then it made this jump as a hurricane and then a major hurricane from the 29th to the 30th into Florida, skirted inland before heading out over the ocean where it soon lost its tropical characteristics. That's all fine and dandy, but this graphic here really highlights to me that nuance that can be hard to get from one storm to another if you're a bird watcher. The initial track going south towards Cozumel off the Yucatan Peninsula doesn't show any tropical storm force winds in yellow. It wasn't strong enough at that time, hadn't been given the name Idalia. But even as it pulled north and went past Cuba, Cuba did have, a remarkably stormy and strong winds, but no hurricane force winds. The hurricane force winds of 64 knots and above didn't start until it was, about as far north as Cuba is, stayed well offshore up into Florida. So I think there's some really interesting considerations here about where these flamingos came from. I think the common thought is, well, the storm went really close to Cuba, the strongest winds were over Cuba, and therefore they must have been forced against their will from Cuba up into the hurricane and traveled inland. But I've got sort of a different theory. And so my gut sort of tells me that these flamingos left Mexico on purpose. They wanted to fly, and they just got caught up in the hurricane after the fact. I'll pull up some weather maps just to go over why that's my thinking. And so I think the details of this slow southward movement, followed by a quick intensification and a jump northward, so it spends upwards of like 3 days brushing Mexico, but then lingering between Mexico and Cuba. There's a lot of north winds, northeast, northwest winds. If I'm a flamingo that wants to leave Mexico and head to Cuba, where I am seems like a pretty good situation to leave. If these birds have any sense of subsound or whatever that tells them there's a hurricane offshore, the storm is not particularly strong, so there may be no trigger that says, hey, this could be a dangerous journey. And then any bird that has taken off, suddenly, while being pulled into this storm, as all air flows into the center, as that storm starts to quickly move north and gain in strength, suddenly all that wind is going to curve and pull you into this circulation even stronger. So any short journey across to Cuba could easily be deviated to the north of Cuba. Interestingly, just 24 hours later, from the last map that I showed you, where Idalia is moving just north of Cuba, 24 hours later, we've got landfall in Florida. So this thing really scooted north as it was getting quite strong. Some flamingos were very likely entrained into the circulation. They got right into the thick of it and then were pulled inland. I believe there was one record not far inland from the coast of a birder out storm birding who saw one in flight. But like another critical component for me is the fact that in the day after and a couple days after, there were flamingos seen all up and down the Florida coast, which sort of demonstrates to me that notion of they were aiming for Cuba, and even if you end up just north of Cuba, you can see how these wind barbs are really blasting into the Florida coastline. And so, that really panned out. This picture was taken on Marco Island in Florida. I can't remember if it was the day of landfall or the day after, but it's way down here, quite a ways away from the hurricane force winds, quite a ways away from the landfall point. But yeah, it just highlights to me that there's a key, in my opinion, a key element of these flamingos wanting to leave that made this different from other storms. And it's a deviated migration route up into Florida, with some birds being so caught up into the hurricane they got entrained into the circulation and pushed even farther inland. So there's sort of two additional thoughts that I have that sort of support my theory of these birds wanting to leave and then getting caught up, as opposed to being forced off of Cuba and heading north. One is this map, which is all the tropical storm and hurricane tracks that we have on record. It is a hurricane-prone part of the world. There have been many a hurricane to cross the Yucatan Peninsula or cross Cuba or the Bahamas and head to Florida or elsewhere in the Gulf Coast. And we have not previously seen such a significant number of flamingos. And also it just comes from finding myself lucky and or unlucky enough to be in storm force winds a few times over the past couple of years. And I've really been quite surprised at how any vertical object, anything down to a bush or a hedgerow, in winds that strong, there's a remarkable calm eddy that forms in behind pretty much any object. And while it's not a safe place to be for a human being, if you are a bird who's trying not to be physically forced away, being on land and having those opportunities to just shelter behind some vegetation, it's really quite remarkable how calm it can be when you're tucked into those environments. So it just seemed like to have so many flamingos go all at once, it just seems to make more sense to me that this is a willing decision. And that's what sets it apart from all these storms of the past. We haven't had that perfect storm of events where a storm lingers in an environment that is conducive for birds to consider leaving, that then intensifies, pulls them in, and pulls them into a place where birders are. And pulling them in fast enough too, because if that storm had have lingered over the Gulf for several days, who knows what kind of bird mortality there may have been inside the core of a storm like that. So yeah, it's all fine and dandy. Still doesn't quite explain how this picture was taken on Lake Michigan in Wisconsin a period of time later. But sort of circling back to these terms, you've had birds that have been deviated and then entrained into a circulation. They get so lost, they become adrift. This is where that super distinctiveness of flamingos comes into play to really drive home some of the interesting points about vagrancy. It's only September 1st, 2 days or less after landfall, and yet flamingos have now shown up in south central Ohio. Looking at the weather charts, it's a fairly calm environment, high pressure, nice weather. This is not a set in stone thing, but I find if I follow these pressure gradients, it kind of gives you a feel for how air is moving through the atmosphere. And if you're a totally lost flamingo that's been pushed into this part of the world and you choose to just go with the flow, it seems possible to me that going with the flow could lead you into Ohio. And this is 3 weeks later for that picture in Wisconsin, but at that point, it's probably next to impossible to really predict where a bird is going to go once it becomes adrift. So there can be long periods of time afterwards, and you don't really know which days they're going to go. But I did find it interesting that this also appears to be a relatively calm weather day. There's a period of time of east winds. Who knows where the flamingos came from, but you have some east winds and suddenly you have birds on the shoreline of the Great Lakes. And we're pushing a week later, but after another day of some sort of gentle, nice weather, east-southeast winds, the same flamingos end up in central Wisconsin. And then another week and a half later, we end up with this period or a couple of days we get west-northwest winds. Who knows if it's the same individual that was seen in Wisconsin? Who knows if birds are finding their way back to where they want to go? Who knows if some of them are being taken down by predators? So I have to imagine a bald eagle would find a flamingo rather interesting. But it's October 11th, and there's a record on Lake Huron, on Lake Michigan, so long after the hurricane had moved through Florida in the southeast. So it's pretty remarkable to track this and to have all these opportunities to more closely monitor when and where these vagrant flamingos were wandering, what weather conditions were causing them to move. It lingered right through to the next spring with at least one, maybe a couple birds moving up and down the Atlantic coast. And I tried to put this theory into test 2 days after the Michigan sighting. I was out on Lake Huron, hoping one would make the jump into Ontario, but alas, even with the best laid plans, these are super rare birds, so you're not necessarily gonna find one just because you go out for a day. And I don't want you to feel too bad. There's always more storms, because I've always got more opportunities to test these theories. Say there was another hurricane in the similar part of the world, and the very next year, but a month later, I said to myself, well, maybe something similar will happen. Maybe I should look at what's going on in Mexico. And so I opened the eBird bar charts for some of the regions in the Yucatan and said, I wonder if there's any interesting birds that might be leaving the Yucatan Peninsula that could somehow get caught up in a circulation and sent to Florida. So I had some interesting species and I thought, why not? Let's give it a try. And maybe I was on the Sanibel Island Causeway in storm force winds when this martin flew by me at dusk. And it was small and interesting and had a bright white belly, but no pale hind color. And yeah, maybe it was too dark to get really good pictures, and maybe it zoomed by, and it highlights the fact that flamingos are a really wonderful species to study vagrancy because they're more distinctive. But I did think it would be fun to put this together and just sort of demonstrate with a really awesome case study the things that could happen and how maybe there would be some more cryptic species that could be tossed into North America following other storm events, and how even if you're not right after when the storm has gone by, that there may still be birds adrift in the continent thereafter. So hope you found it interesting. Hope it was informative. I'm always keen to learn more. So if you think I'm right or wrong or have any feedback or critical thoughts, I'm keen to hear them. I also want to say a couple of huge thank yous to some awesome human beings, such as Stephen Thompson in Wisconsin, who sent me a few flamingo photos to use as eye candy for this presentation. Instagram link, check it out. A few other photos were courtesy of Jeremy Mayer. Thank you so much, Jeremy. I would highly suggest people to check out his photography website. Link here. The other links are below. And to Owen Strickland, who is an Ontario birder but somehow found himself in Florida, who took that photo that I used in the presentation. Sorry, Owen, I don't know if you have an Instagram or anything. but I would highly suggest people check out that eBird checklist that he had in Florida because it is incredible. So type that one into your browser. It is worth it. And so yeah, that's my flamingo theories. Happens to be winter right now where I am, but we're keeping our eyes peeled for signs of spring over the coming weeks. I hope you have some great birding out there, and I'll be back with more of these in the future.